Hey guys! Part 5 of What If Naruto Graduates 2 Years Early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 15, Wave, Return to Konoha. A week and a half after the three-way ANBU battle, Kakashi sighed in relief as he set foot on the newly completed bridge and took the first step on his journey home, glad that the mission from hell that he just completed with the completion of the bridge was finally over. He would say that Wave was a nice place to visit, not to live, but as far as he was concerned, it was either. Give him Konoha any day of the week. Konoha, where food was plentiful, he wasn't attacked by missing Nin, and ANBU didn't hold battles royal in the street. God, he'd even take the constant bickering of his students, which seemed to have cooled down a bit recently, over coming back here. He'd even be willing to take 3 straight days of Mato Guy doing nothing but pestering him about stupid challenges over coming back here. Hell, he almost felt like kissing Mato Guy the next time he saw him. Almost. Come to think of it, he'd rather go on a vacation to IWA than come back here. In his cell in Konoha, Zabuza studied the chakra suppression seal that had been placed on him by the ANBU team that had transported him to Konoha, since it gave him something to do while he waited. He was in ANBU custody, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before he was interrogated. Haku, who was the weaker of the two of them, had been taken already, and had been gone for over an hour. As he finished examining the seal with little more than academic interest because his skills lay elsewhere, Haku returned to their holding cell looking pale and slightly shaken. He quickly squashed his feeling of worry at the sight of this, as well as the number of increasingly horrifying scenarios that had cropped up as he gazed upon his servant's pale and shaken countenance, which increased his own concerns for his own fate. Whatever they had done to the boy had to have been really bad for him to have reacted this way, and while he didn't want to know because it would only bring down his own morale, he knew that he needed to know in order to know what to expect for his own interrogation. "What did they do to you?" he asked. "They took me to see the Hokage," Haku replied quietly. "And?" he asked, wondering what the Hokage had done to the boy to make him this upset. "He offered me a plot of land and a list of available women," Haku replied, holding up the sheaf of papers that in his distracted state he previously hadn't noticed were in the boy's hand. "What did you say?" he asked, wondering if his tool, his weapon, his Haku had left him. "I told him no, but he handed me the papers and told me to look them over and think about it," Haku replied. Looking at those papers that could even now become the cause of Haku's eventual betrayal and departure, he understood why Haku was upset. Haku had already thought about it. It may have been for only a second or two, but the fact that he had even paused to seriously consider the offer had been enough to upset the boy whose life had revolved entirely around him for so long. Back in Wave, Tazuna watched as Inari cried over the fact that his hero was leaving for Konoha. The boy had been good for Inari, had pulled him out of his shell, and started to turn him back to the somewhat happy boy he remembered from back before Gato had tried to destroy them. Naruto had been good for Wave as a whole as well. He had killed Gato, driven off his mercenaries, and given Inari and everyone else the courage to stand up and fight for what was theirs. Should Naruto return, there wasn't a home in the village that wouldn't open their doors to him, despite the fact that he possessed an extremely dangerous, unknown, and unnatural power. The other ninja from Konoha, however, let's just say that the old-timers were strongly reminded of the reason why Wave had not given permission for another ninja village to form after Yuza fell and the former country of Whirlpool had reformed under a new name after being almost completely crushed. That reason could be summed up in only 2 words, and those words were collateral and damage. There tended to be a lot of it when ninja were around. While only minimal and mostly cosmetic repair work had to be made to the bridge as a result of Naruto's rampage, an entire section of bridge had needed to be replaced thanks to the structural weakening and the internal damage caused by Kakashi's dogs burrowing into it. Then, on top of the damage to the bridge, there was the damage that had been caused to the town during the three-way ANBU free-for-all. Fortunately, this damage wasn't anywhere near as bad as it could have been, since the strange one with the red and blue cat mask had used a strange jutsu that was capable of creating habitable buildings that were up to code, and the team medic had tended to the injured civilians before they completely swamped Dr. Yoshida. And people wondered why insurance premiums in the countries that had ninja villages were sky high. As he watched Naruto and his team travel down the bridge he had decided to name after the boy who had defeated Gato and his minions and paved a way for a brighter future in Wave, and back toward Fire Country, he hoped that when he kept his promise to Inari and returned someday, he wouldn't bring anyone else with him. Things broke often enough around here without any outside interference, and they didn't need another bunch of ninja helping the process along. Home. Finally, Naruto muttered as he and the team took their first steps into Fire Country. And I thought my first C rank was bad. Why? Sakura asked. What happened on your first C rank? Satoshi gambled away all the travel funds, and I had to throw myself under a horse to get more money, he replied. I'd heard about the first C rank curse, but I didn't believe it until then. How do you get money by throwing yourself under a horse? Sasuke asked. You find the sort of drunk who thinks he can buy his way out of anything, and play dead while your teammates shake him for cash, he replied. But that's... Sakura started, staring at him both horrified and at a loss for words. Sasuke just gave him a dubious glance as if he wasn't sure he should believe him or not. Seems Shimura's still up to his old tricks, Kakashi said. Who's Shimura? Sakura asked. Naruto's former sensei, Kakashi replied. He's something of a con artist. A con artist? Sakura said, sounding stunned. His mother came from a family of tea country grifters, Kakashi said, sounding somewhat disapproving. She taught him a few tricks of the trade. Some are useful for a shinobi career, and some most definitely are not. What the hell was Kakashi's problem? He couldn't still be sore about the way Tetsuo-sensei had weaseled a favor out of him. That was like ages ago. Tetsuo-sensei had told him the story last year, and it had been pretty damn funny. After that exchange on the border of Fire Country, the team continued on their way, and eventually reached Konoha where Naruto found his old team waiting for him. Tetsuo-sensei, he yelled as he raced up to his teacher and gave him one of the flying tackle hugs he was still famous for despite all efforts to curb this impulse. Shimura Tetsuo naturally went flying backward and hit the ground with Naruto on top of him squeezing the stuffing out of him. Suzume and Satoshi soon turned it into a group hug, which rapidly devolved into the bunch of them roughhousing in front of the village gates. Missed you too, kid, Tetsuo replied as he ruffled Naruto's hair when they had finished playing. Now what's this I hear about you taking out an A-ranked missing nin and the head of a multinational corporation? Kakashi growled as he watched Naruto and his former teammates get up from where they had piled on top of their former sensei and started play fighting. What a perfect way to end the trip from hell. He thought that he'd made progress with Naruto when the boy had practically hovered over him when he was ill, but the instant Shimura showed up, Naruto hadn't given him one of those flying tackle hugs since he taught him the Kage Bunshin. Sure, he threw the kid into a tree headfirst when he did so that one time, but still. He'd be happy if the boy had shown him even half the amount of affection and respect he showed Shimura. The boy hadn't even shown him a quarter of the regard he gave the other man so far. Sakura watched Naruto greet his Tetsuo-sensei and a pair of Chunin who'd been standing with the man in amazement. She had never seen him that happy, not even at the academy. The closest to being that happy she'd ever seen Naruto had been when he was with Yumino-sensei. Watching him now, it was almost as if she were looking at an entirely different person. Had being on this team really made him that miserable? Had she made him that miserable? The entire time he'd been with her, Sasuke-kun and Kakashi-sensei, he'd been unhappy and suffering, and she had never once done anything to help, even back during the days at the academy when he had followed her around like a lost puppy, taking all the abuse she dished out because it was a form of acknowledgement of his existence at least. Sakura-chan, will you go out with me? Naruto said for what had to be the millionth time as they returned from target practice. Grr, no! Smack. Sakura-chan, I got you something, Naruto said, grinning from ear to ear as he held up a small white box. She opened the box, and a white frog jumped out. She shrieked. Naruto! You jerk! Smack. Naruto looked stunned and disappointed by her reaction to the gift. Sakura-chan, Naruto started as he ran up to her yet again. Smack. Sakura-chan. Naruto started as he moved to sit next to her. Smack. Sakura-chan. Naruto started as he got off his favorite swing and raced over to her. Smack. Naruto may have been downright annoying back then, but she had been vicious and cruel, and people had allowed her to be this way because it was just Naruto. If she had done what she had done to someone else, her parents would have severely reprimanded her. Hell, the other kids' parents would have reprimanded her as well. So would the academy instructors and just about every other adult who witnessed her behavior. But because it was just Naruto, despite the fact that he should be entirely focused on teaching the children in front of him, Iruka was subtly watching the clock as he waited for the day to end. Naruto was expected to get back today, and he wanted to see how the boy was doing since he'd heard some disturbing rumors involving the mission that Naruto had been on. He wanted to make sure the Naruto was alright, especially since his former pupil hadn't been adjusting to his new team all that well, and there would undoubtedly have been friction between Naruto and his teammates on their first mission outside the village no matter how well the mission had gone. What had the Hokage been thinking putting Naruto on a team with Uchiha Sasuke and Haruno Sakura? Both Sasuke and Sakura hated Naruto. Back when the boy was at the academy, if one wasn't abusing him, the other was, and Sasuke hadn't taken Naruto's early graduation all that well. In fact, he'd completely denied that it had happened. Instead of being given a class of returnees as he had been expecting, he had been sent to replace an instructor who was out on maternity leave as an instructor for the autumn rotation cycle class of 8 to 9-year-olds when the academy came back in session in January. He suspected that the reason for this had been because of Konohamaru, who had joined the class in January as well. The Hokage had trusted him to educate Naruto, and now, because he hadn't failed that trust, he was being trusted to educate the Hokage's grandson as well, and he would do his best not to fail him there either. The Hokage's grandson was another reason he was constantly watching the clock, because Naruto had taught Konohamaru the trick to moving the hands of the clock forward without the teacher noticing, and the boy had decided to become a miniature copy of Naruto, pranks and all. Fortunately, he had learned to wear a watch years ago. Konohamaru sat in his seat practically vibrating in excitement as the seconds ticked down towards the end of the school day. Naruto would be back soon, he just knew it. Naruto would be back, and they would have a lot of fun together, and Naruto would teach him something new, and tell him about all of the adventures he had. 59 minutes and 37 seconds to go before he could get out of here and see if Naruto had returned. 36. 35. 34. The Hokage sighed when Team 7 left his office after making their report. Thanks to them, he would be forced to open negotiations with Kiri, which would be somewhat more difficult than usual since there was a vacancy where there should be a Mizukage, because he had 2 missing nin from Kiri that he didn't exactly know what to do with. The fact that he'd offered one of them the standard Kekkai Genkai bonus package could raise issues considering the fact that Zabuza's follower wasn't officially a ninja and could technically still be considered a citizen of Water Country since he hadn't officially renounced that right. Then, there was that free-for-all in Wave that he was certain was entirely Danzo's fault, as it had been his ninjas who had started the whole fracas when they pretended to be a team of hunter nin from Kiri piled on top of what was already a touchy situation. Either one of these issues would be a headache to deal with. Both of them combined made this situation a migraine of epic proportions. Why was it that whenever Naruto got within a mile of a citizen from Kirigakure, he was stuck dealing with some sort of diplomatic incident? Chapter 16. Chunin Exams, Suna Arrivals. Sakura panted as she dodged Kamizuki Suzume's blow. The spar, as always, was far more intense than any of the workouts she had gotten during her regular training. In addition to her daily training with Team 7, and the D-rank missions she was now grateful for after having experienced a C-rank and seeing how badly missions could go wrong once one left Konoha's gates, she trained with Suzume 3 afternoons a week when the other girl wasn't on missions. Naruto had introduced them to each other shortly after she had asked him what she would need to do in order to prepare for the Chunin exams when they returned to Konoha back in April, several weeks after she had come to the epiphany that her life, whichever course it ended up taking, could only begin after she passed the Chunin exams. She remembered the look on Naruto's face when he'd asked her if she was serious. That look of shock and incredulity that had crossed the boy's face had hurt. Had she really acted as if she hadn't taken being a ninja seriously so much that when she finally wanted to do something above and beyond what she had been doing she was met with surprise and disbelief? Sure, she had spent an inordinate amount of time on the pursuit of her future husband, but she had still studied and trained. Apparently not enough, however, as the mission in Wave and her training with Naruto's former teammate clearly illustrated. But she had trained nonetheless. Eventually, after taking several blows, her training session with Suzume ended, and both girls parted ways. She had learned from Naruto that Suzume's goal was to start her own dojo after she retired from the shinobi forces, and she believed the girl could do it. Not only was Suzume skilled in the martial arts, but she was a good teacher, and she could also see why Naruto liked her so much, because she was a good and kind if somewhat strict person as well. After parting ways with Suzume, she headed home for dinner. When she arrived, her mom was in the kitchen preparing the meal which, much to her relief, seemed to be traditional fare rather than one of her frequent experiments this evening. Sometimes, her mother's kitchen experiments were appreciated, but most often they were not. After inspecting the evening meal and finding it to be edible, she went upstairs to shower and change, and when she came down, dinner was ready. "So, how was your day?" her mother asked her when everyone was settled at the table. Her father tried to look interested in her reply, but had grown so used to years of girl talk since he was completely outnumbered in that area that he automatically tuned everything out. She could tell that he was tuning her out again, because her dad's eyes had that slightly glazed over look that said, "I'll nod at appropriate intervals so I don't end up on the couch, otherwise, I'm not listening." Training went better than usual, as it's been going since Sasuke quit trying to pick fights with Naruto. They still don't seem to like each other, but at least they're not arguing. She started, as she picked up her rice bowl. "Our mission today was walking dogs. It wasn't so bad. There was a rather funny incident where a dog that was almost the size of a horse tried to pull Kakashi sensei's arms out of their sockets." She continued before taking a bite of her rice, which fortunately didn't have any exotic spices added to it this evening. "After the mission, I trained with Suzume-san for a bit." "I don't see why you hang out with that girl," her mother said disapprovingly. "Someone who spends that much time with that Uzumaki boy isn't." "Isn't what, mother?" "Suzume is a loyal shinobi of Konoha and a chunin," she said, upset that her mother was harping on that again. "She has volunteered to train me when she could be occupying what little free time she has with something more worthwhile out of the kindness of her heart." "But still," her mother started. She sighed. She loved her mother, but there were times when the woman could be absolutely trying. She wasn't going to stop hanging out with Suzume. Suzume was helping her get ready to pass the chunin exams when she took them next year. End of discussion. Momochi's abusa shifted uncomfortably as he waited in the Mizuki's office more than 2 months after he'd been captured by that team from Konoha, and less than a week after Konoha had turned him over to Kiri. Practically the instant the Godame had been selected, the Hokage had shipped him back to Kiri with an admonition of "Don't let us catch you again." Instead of being immediately executed as he had expected to be upon arrival, he had been brought to meet with the Godame Mizuki, whoever he was. After what had been an interminable wait, the door to the room finally opened, and a very familiar woman with exceedingly long auburn hair and green eyes who was dressed in rather revealing clothing walked in. Instead of announcing the Mizuki's imminent arrival, the woman calmly walked across the room and seated herself at the desk that had once belonged to Yagura and whoever that asshole who had been controlling him had been. He'd liked Yagura before he became Mizuki, and had only reluctantly decided to kill him and take his place to end the bloodshed his rule had caused. The idea of being Mizuki himself hadn't been all that bad either. Mizuki Momochi had a rather nice ring to it, and he probably would have succeeded in his endeavor despite the sanbai, if the jerk who had been pulling Yagura's strings hadn't interfered. He was sharply pulled out of his musings about what had happened the last time he'd set foot in this office by a sudden realization. Mei was the Mizuki. Mei was a few years older than him, and he dated her a couple of times, so he knew that she was the sort of woman who was very capable at whatever she set her mind to. But Mizuki? "Most of my current advisors have advised me to have you publicly executed to further cement my position," the new Mizuki said. "You seem to have a great deal of popular support, and would therefore be a threat to me. I am not about to hand over my new hat so soon after I got it, and you know full well that if it came down to a fight, I would win. May continued, leaning forward slightly as she shifted position, and probably rather deliberately giving him a better view of her cleavage. I am always in need of capable advisors, May said, shifting back to a less revealing position. That is why I came up with a solution that would satisfy both of us, and some of the traditionalists who don't believe a woman should be in power as well. Should you refuse my offer, or attempt to take my position, I will be forced to kill you, and that is something I would seriously regret, especially considering our friendship. It was at that point that the new Mizukage opened a drawer of her desk, pulled out a small velvet box, and tossed it to him. He caught it, and cautiously opened it, hoping that it wasn't trapped or something. What was inside was a trap, but not one in the traditional sense. It was a gold ring. He now had two choices: accept the offer it represented, or die. Congratulations, Zabuza-sama, Haku said before he could give his answer. It had been the angered yells that had drawn Naruto's attention, while he had been wandering the village with no destination in particular, since he couldn't think of anything else to do since he'd finished his training for the day and hadn't been in the mood to sit still with a book. When he arrived at the site of the confrontation, which was taking place on the road just inside the main gate that had attracted his notice, it had been to see Satoshi being attacked by someone from the arriving Suna delegation who was dressed in an outfit that resembled the costume of a Bunraku puppeteer. The Bunraku boy's teammates and Jounin sensei held back to remain with the boy while the main group, which seemed to consist of 8 or 9 other teams, made their way past them and to the administration complex. He could easily guess why Satoshi had been attacked, because it was almost always the reason why Satoshi ended up being involved in fights these days. He'd gotten caught swiping something. "Damn it, Satoshi!" he yelled as he moved to aid the Chunin. "How many times have you been told not to steal from our allies?" "Sorry about that," he said to the members of the Suna team when he arrived. "Satoshi here's a bit of a kleptomaniac." "It's okay," the Jounin replied with an amused smile. "Kankuro here needed a lesson on why hiding his more valuable possessions is a good idea." As he and the Suna Jounin conversed, several Chunin who had apparently been alerted to the confrontation by the gate guards broke the fight up, and from the looks of things, Satoshi would be spending at least a week in jail. It would probably be good for him. Tetsuo-sensei was always saying that he needed something to shake him up and teach him his lesson. Jail and a black mark on his record probably wouldn't be enough, however, which was a pity since despite his compulsion to steal anything and everything, Satoshi was a very good ninja. He'd hate to see him dismissed from the ranks over something like this. "How about I show you a shortcut to the administration complex, so you can get signed in, and afterward I'll show you where the best places to eat are," he said after Satoshi had been hauled away, hoping to soothe relations between them and Konoha a bit. "Thank you," the Jounin said. "I really don't want us to be too much trouble, though." "No trouble at all," he replied. "I didn't have anything else to do this evening, and Satoshi used to be my teammate until he got promoted, so it's the least I can do." As he followed the blonde boy's lead, Gaara studied the boy named Naruto, wondering what the boy had done to earn such antipathy from the civilian population. When he'd first noticed the stares of the villagers, he had thought that they had been directed at him, and had a great deal of difficulty not killing the people outright as mother called for their blood. If he had done so, the plan that had been put in place by his father and the village elders would be ruined and they would be forced to flee. While he personally didn't care if that happened, the results of his ruining his father's plans would cause more irritation than they were worth, as he would never hear the end of it. And if he killed father in order to shut him up, he would never hear the end of that either, even if he eliminated the entire population of Suna. Mother would most likely bring it up to annoy him, and mother wasn't going anywhere. It was when he heard the comments that he realized that the cold stares from the civilians weren't directed at him, but at their guide through the village instead. How could the cheerful boy who was currently guiding them to his favorite restaurant on their way to their new quarters ignore all of that? How could he go day to day listening to that, and not want to kill the people around him? He wanted to kill them after less than 5 minutes. Heck, he'd wanted to kill them after less than 5 seconds. Without seeming to want anything in return, the boy named Naruto had offered to show them around. Not Kankuro, not Temari, not Baki, all of them. He knew that the boy couldn't have failed to notice the fear with which his siblings and teammates had regarded him, but despite that, the boy had still treated him with the same kindness as he had the others. Even though he felt hesitation because of this, there was still the question over whether or not the boy was strong enough that killing him would validate his existence. Mother was uncertain about him. As the boy led the way to the restaurant, ignoring the stares and comments along the way, he nattered on about some team who had been throwing snowballs during the Chunin exams in Kiri a year and a half ago. Temari, Kankuro, and Baki found this story very amusing for some strange reason. He didn't find it all that entertaining, however. Finally, after following the boy through several winding streets, the group arrived at a stand called the Chiraku that apparently sold ramen. While ramen wasn't his favorite food, it wasn't his least favorite food either. It wasn't all that common in Suna actually, and he'd only had it maybe once or twice before, so he hadn't formed much of an opinion of it. Kankuro and Temari didn't seem all that happy about the boy's choice, but they didn't seem too dismayed either. Baki just shrugged, smiled, and took a seat next to the one the boy was moving towards. Apparently, no insult had been intended by the boy's selection of eatery. "Hey, Tuchi-san, I brought you some more customers," the blonde boy called out to the stand's proprietor as soon as he was seated. Unlike the treatment the boy received from the village's other civilians, the greeting Naruto received from the proprietor of the stand was cheerful and enthusiastic. He could see why this place would be the boy's favorite restaurant. Even if the food wasn't the best, the atmosphere alone was relatively pleasant. Baki watched the boy that intelligence had indicated was the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi no Kitsune interact with Gaara. The difference between the two boys was like night and day. Where Gaara was cold and withdrawn, Naruto was open and rather friendly, and he could tell that it mostly wasn't an act to put him and his students off their guard. Based on the behavior of the civilian population, it had not been their actions towards the boy that had made the difference between him and Gaara, which made him wonder all the more what had. As he watched the boy converse with his students and eat, he ate a meal of his own. While ramen wasn't his favorite food, it was acceptable. The name of the stand's owner was fitting for a ninja village, as it could mean both to make noodles by hand and to kill with one's bare hands. Based on the looks he was receiving from the man was fully willing to try to live up to the second meaning of his name if he made any untoward moves towards Konoha's Jinchuriki. Perhaps that was the difference between the two boys. The few people who actually cared for the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki had gotten to him in time. Chapter 17, Chunin Exams, Mizukage Marriage. Zabuza still couldn't figure out how Mei had managed to throw together a traditional wedding so fast. The wedding had happened a week after Mei had made her ultimatum, rather than after the months it usually took to properly plan and arrange such an undertaking. And the only way he could think of how that could have happened was that she had everything ready and waiting for when she finally netted a husband, and only had to schedule the time of the wedding. All he really knew was that it had happened so fast that it had made his head spin. Practically 1 minute he was a relatively free man, and the next, he had a Mrs. Momochi hanging off his arm. At this moment, he could consider himself to be rather fortunate. He was alive and he had a beautiful wife, and things could have been worse, a lot worse. Still, being married to the Mizukage had not been one of his stated goals in life. Admittedly, the first 4 were male, but still. As they negotiated the crowd of well-wishers and ass-kissers that had shown up to congratulate the new couple, Mei latched onto his arm as if she was almost afraid that he'd try to escape. Hako hovered nearby, ready to provide protection if it were needed. Considering the fact that Mei had 2 Kekei Genkai, it probably wouldn't be. "How many kids do you plan on having?" some guy in the crowd asked as they passed by. Kids? Oh God. He could see it now. Even if they inherited only one of Mei's Kekei Genkai, it would be bad enough when they start discovering their powers. A kid with dark reddish-brown hair and brown eyes argues with his or her black-haired, green-eyed older sibling. All of a sudden, the Mizukage residence where he was stuck living as a house husband starts filling up with lava. Thank the gods that Haku would be there to sort things out. The evening before the Chunin exams were to start, Kankuro made his way to the barbecue restaurant that blonde ninja had pointed out on the way back to Suna's quarters on his first day here. Tomorrow was the first day of the Chunin exams, and he figured that it would be well worth the expense to have a good dinner before they happened in case he didn't survive what was coming next. On his way to the restaurant, he saw a reasonably attractive civilian woman following a masked, one-eyed shinobi who seemed to be doing his level best to ignore her. The civilians in Suna had learned not to try something like that long ago because if a shinobi didn't want attention, they didn't want attention, and clinging to them would more than likely result in severe injuries on the civilian's part. "Don't see how you can stand putting up with him," the woman said to the shinobi, who looked like he dearly wanted to shake the woman off but didn't quite dare to do so for some reason. "And now, he's hanging around with foreigners. I wouldn't be surprised if his father was from IWA." It was at that point that the shinobi finally decided to react. If he hadn't been a shinobi himself, he probably wouldn't have noticed it, and would have thought it an accident like most of the other passers-by had. Most of the streets in Konoha were simply hard-packed dirt as they had been since the founding of the village. While there wasn't too much dust due to certain dust control methods which had been put in place, including D-ranked missions assigned during the driest part of the year, there was the occasional mud puddle here or there either after it rained, or there was a spill of some sort. In a lightning-fast move, the shinobi tripped the woman, knocked her into a particularly large and somewhat scummy-looking puddle that the other pedestrians had been avoiding, and continued on his way as if nothing had happened. Having apparently reached the end of his rope and decided that doing so was worth the potential consequences should he be caught. As he continued on his way to the restaurant, chuckling over the stupidity of the woman who had apparently insulted a friend of the shinobi, several people moved to help the woman who was shrieking as if someone had just tried to murder her. The place he was going to was owned by one of the local ninja clans, and it was totally awesome. He'd been there once before, and he could completely understand how the Akimichi got so fat. Tamari sighed as she walked through the park that had supposedly been built shortly after the founding of the village in a joint effort between the Shodai Hokage and the head of the Uchiha clan, which had been pointed out to her by the blonde Konoha genin on the way to register for the exams which would be starting the next day. There were trees and flowers everywhere she cared to look as she wandered the main path. Both were a rather rare sight back in Suna since only the hardiest of plants grew in the deep desert where her home was located. Briefly pausing in her tracks, she bent over to smell one of the roses that grew on the well-tended bushes that lined the cobblestone path. It was a real pity that this would all be gone soon. Both her village and Otogekyo would be razing the village to the ground in a little over a month if things went according to plan. A park like this, no matter how nice, would not survive the coming battle. Gaara felt slightly apprehensive about going to the ramen stand while the boy named Naruto wasn't there. While the man who ran the stall treated him like just another customer while his best customer was there, he wasn't entirely certain that he would be treated the same if he weren't. And he wasn't too sure how he would react if he were treated differently. The man who had run the ramen stand had been one of the few people in his life to actually be nice to him, and expect little to nothing in return. When he reached Ichiraku Ramen, he took an available seat next to a black-haired shinobi and waited. The owner noticed him after a few seconds. "Welcome," the man said warmly, giving him a genuine smile as he did so. Despite the fact that Naruto wasn't here to protect him or whatever, the man wasn't trembling, and there wasn't any fear in his eyes. The man actually seemed to appreciate his presence. Relieved that this was so, he made his order, which the man promptly began to prepare. That settled it. When the time for the invasion came, he was going to have this man kidnapped and brought to Suna. Preparing for the upcoming Chunin exams which Kakashi had only just informed him that he'd signed the team up for that afternoon, Naruto carefully inspected his equipment, discarding anything that was irreparable. He would buy replacements for everything he discarded at the local supply store once he was done. If the exams followed the same format they had in Kiri, there would be a test of information gathering skills followed by a test of team survival skills. He and his equipment would both need to be in top form during the second portion of the exams. Fortunately here, things would go differently since he held the home ground advantage. He knew the forests surrounding the village like the back of his hand from all of the time he spent playing in them. He knew just about every rock, tree, and hunting trap for miles around in any direction. He would be able to tell if anything was off long before he reached any traps or ambushes, and react accordingly. This time, he would pass. This time, nobody on his team would be injured. This time, none of his comrades would die. Once he finished examining and sorting his supplies, he started sharpening his shuriken and kunai. Sakura went to inform Suzume that they wouldn't be meeting the next day because she had been entered into the Chunin exams. She had almost forgotten to do so in her excitement, and it was only when she had been mentally going over her taijutsu skills that she'd realized that she had a training session scheduled with Suzume tomorrow. This was 6 months earlier than she had expected to be entered, but she would be ready, she had to be. 3 months ago, she would have been uncertain about this, and spent the entire night worrying over whether she should take the exams or not, and she would have decided to take them in the end because Sasuke would be taking them, and she didn't want Sasuke to leave her behind. Now, she was going to take the exams, because they were the next step towards her future goal, and she would pass on her own merits, and for her own reasons. While she didn't want Sasuke to leave her behind, that wouldn't be the only reason she would be taking the exams. The Chunin exams were the first major step on the road to her future, and she would need to pass them to find where that road would lead. As he got some last-minute training in, Sasuke pummeled the training post in front of him with his fists, imagining that it was that man. He would be taking the Chunin exams tomorrow, and he needed to be in top form. Kakashi had sprung their entry into the Chunin exams on them as a surprise only that afternoon when he'd turned them loose from the day's training. If he'd informed them, say, whenever it was that he'd entered them, he would have had more time to train and prepare. As it was, he was stuck getting in a great deal of last-minute training, and hoping that he wouldn't be too exhausted tomorrow morning when they went to take the first test. That boy had told him to expect something along the lines of an information-gathering exercise which would be followed by a survival test of some sort that included combat. In order to prepare for the coming ordeal, he would train for a few more hours, and then he would gather any equipment he thought necessary for the exams. As the moon rose higher in the sky, causing the barred windows to cast bands of shadow, Satoshi lay back on the bunk in his cell. The last 6 days had been boring as hell. He would be getting out tomorrow, but not in time for the exams, so he wouldn't be playing Genin Plant as he had been assigned to be before he'd gotten arrested. He wondered if Naruto was entered into this one, as he hadn't said a word about it when he dropped by to visit. He was pretty sure that he would have said something before now if he were entered, but then again, Naruto hadn't visited him since his first day here because he wanted him to learn his lesson. He honestly couldn't believe that he'd got caught stealing from a measly genin. Just for that, he was going to rob Bunraku Boy and his teammates blind before they went home. Tetsuo smiled as he played with his daughter who was crawling around, and making a mess out of a pile of blocks. Tomorrow, Naruto would be taking the Chunin exams, and he wouldn't be able to be there for him, because Hatake Kakashi was his sensei on paper. He could still wish him luck and cheer him on, however, and he would be doing just that. Satoshi would be getting out of jail tomorrow afternoon as well. He sometimes wondered where he went wrong with the boy, and then he remembered that it wasn't him. His wife was a bit like Satoshi, but had sworn to quit stealing if he quit conning people. So far, they both had technically kept their word. The beloved missus for whom he'd happily sacrificed anything and everything had caught his attention when she had lifted his wallet, and he had gotten hers when he conned her out of the 25,000 rios she had stolen from him. It had been love at first sight. He'd known it when he'd taken back merely what she'd stolen from him, and nothing more. If she'd just been a job to him, he would have gotten more than that piddling sum. The Hokage held the unopened letter he just received from the Mizukage, almost dreading what would be inside. Considering the way his luck had been going in regards to Kirigakyu lately, there was a good chance that it would be another mess that would need to be sorted out. Just what he needed when he was already busy dealing with the Chunin exams. Eventually, after a great deal of deliberation, he decided to open the letter and get it over with the way one would finally rip off a band-aid. The sooner he read it, the sooner he could deal with whatever it was that needed to be dealt with. Anticipating the worst, he broke the seal and opened the scroll. Here goes nothing. Huh! All that worry over nothing. It was just a letter apologizing to him for not inviting him to the wedding between the new Mizukage and one Momochi Zabuza. Well, that was unexpected. After getting home and feeding his dogs, Kakashi ate his own meal in silence. Today had been a rather trying day, and tomorrow would be nerve-wracking. He had entered his team into the Chunin exams much the way Minato sensei had entered him and his first team shortly after they'd graduated, so they could see exactly what they were up against and become determined to do better next time. It was best to set them up for failure now, so they would know what they needed in order to succeed later. Unlike him himself when he had been first sent to the exams, his team most likely wouldn't make it through, as they were barely willing to work with each other, and several larger, stronger, older, and more unified teams had been entered from Konoha alone. Right now, they were marginally better than they had been before the C rank from Hell, but it didn't seem to be enough. He would be there for them though, and he would wish them luck even though luck wouldn't be enough in this case. In the Mizukage Tower in Kiri, Haku stood guard outside the door to the Mizukage's bedroom. He was going to make sure that nobody would intrude on this most important of nights. Back in the village he'd lived near when he was little, it had been something of a tradition to make a lot of noise outside of the home of a newlywed couple on their wedding night. He had a feeling that Zabuza-sama wouldn't appreciate that though, and therefore had kept any local well-wishers away accordingly. As he began to drift off, there was a loud yell that pulled him out of his half-awake state. Before he could even think, he raced into the room from which the yell came only to find that Zabuza-sama and the new Mizukage were in a tangle of limbs and covers on the bed, and that there were no signs of intruders or a fight. "Haku," Zabuza said, sounding somewhat irritated. "Yes?" he asked. "Get out." Blushing so badly that his normally exceedingly pale face probably looked like a tomato, he complied with his master's orders. Chapter 18, Chunin Exams, Kabuto the Show-Off. Inuzuka Kiba swallowed his nervousness as he entered the room in which the first stage of the Chunin exams was to take place. There had been some sort of logjam in the corridor on the second floor due to some sort of commotion that had been caused by a few Chunin hopefuls, but that hadn't been much of a problem for his team since Hinata had helped them negotiate it with little difficulty. The room in which the test was to take place was one of the classrooms at the academy. It had a somewhat different layout than the classroom he'd been assigned to when he attended the academy, however, as instead of the tiered seating he'd grown used to over the years he'd spent as a student, all of the desks were on one level. Adding to the somewhat foreign atmosphere was the fact that the room was completely packed with teenagers, all of whom looked older than him and his team. They were clustered in small groups and lounging around on the desks, chairs, and floor, and they looked to be from just about everywhere, Kiri, Suna, you name it. While a large number of them were just silently waiting for what was to come, most were carrying on hushed conversations both spoken and in sign. Just being here just about put him into sensory overload thanks to all of the unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells. Fortunately, he had his teammates to ground him. The Ino Shikacho team showed up a couple minutes after his team's arrival. With the exception of Shikamaru, who always seemed relaxed, they looked as nervous as he felt. Ino was twitching slightly as she surveyed the room and took in what he had minutes earlier, and Chuji was betraying his anxiety by eating at a far more rapid pace than normal. All three clustered together a little more tightly than they had when they first walked into the room, as if seeking comfort from companions they had known all their lives. Team 7 showed up about a minute later, making it the entire rookie 8+1 that had been entered into the exams. Sakura looked rather nervous, and both Sasuke and Naruto had serious expressions on their faces. Naruto, having taken the exams before, obviously knew exactly what he and his team were up against. It was still strange, however, to see such a serious expression on Naruto's face, and such a stillness in his movements. The Naruto he'd known at the academy had never worn such an expression, and had never been able to sit completely still. Naruto had been even louder and wilder than him back then. Sasuke always looked grim. Practically the instant Team 7 arrived, Ano started molesting Sasuke, while trading what had become her usual greeting with Sakura since they had decided to become rivals over a boy that couldn't care less about either of them, instead of the best of friends that they used to be. Completely ignoring Sasuke's plight, Naruto exchanged greetings with Shikamaru and Chuji, who he and Naruto used to hang out with on occasion while Naruto was still in the academy. Sasuke himself pretended he wasn't being fought over by a pair of fangirls, and ignored, or rather pretended to ignore, everyone else in the group. Since everyone was here, he decided to lead his team over to the two other teams to say hi, as it had been a while since he'd seen them, and almost 2 years since he'd last talked to Naruto when he'd interrupted one of the boys' D ranks the summer after Sasuke had started his Naruto the Dropout kick. That, and Hinata had the damnedest crush on the Uzumaki boy, and if he didn't get her to say hi to him, nothing would. While he and Naruto hadn't exactly been friends, they had ditched the academy together often enough to almost be considered such, and the little group he, Naruto, Shikamaru, and Chuji had formed hadn't exactly been the same without him. Naruto had been the high-spirited Omega of the pack, and even though the boy had constantly challenged each of the others' positions in the group, he'd always gotten knocked back down to the bottom. Now, however, it almost seemed as if Naruto was the alpha of his own pack. After getting a closer look at Sasuke's misfortune, he exchanged greetings with the group of former classmates that he'd only seen in passing since the academy, as he'd been too busy to make much time to visit with them. Shikamaru mumbled a vague greeting, but then again, that was his style. Naruto smiled at Hinata, nearly causing her to faint, and Chuji made one of his usual jokes about wanting to eat Akamaru, who had yet to hit his growth spurt. The dogs that the Inuzuka kept were much smarter than, and lived much longer than ordinary dogs, and would usually hit a growth spurt at around 3 to 4 years of age, during which they would rapidly shoot up to their full adult size. Sasuke ignored him as usual, and Sakura and Ino were still too busy arguing over Sasuke to really notice them. "Hey Kabuto. You failed again, I see," Naruto said when a gray-haired boy, or possibly young man as he appeared to be somewhere between his mid-teens and very early 20s, walked up to the group to tell them to keep it down. "Actually, I missed the winter exams because I was sick," the boy named Kabuto replied. "You know him?" Ino asked, distracted from Sasuke by the newcomer, who seemed to be the type that girls squealed over and called cute, as he had the even features of most males that were regarded as such. "Yeah, I met him during the Kiri exams. He's Yakushi Kabuto, medic, and quite possibly the next Eternal Genin. He's failed the exams 6 times so far," Naruto replied. "Next Eternal Genin?" he asked. There was actually someone who had really earned the moniker of the Eternal Genin? He thought that was an urban legend, like the clan of ninjas that supposedly lived in the sewers. "Yeah, the Eternal Genin's this really neat old guy who's been a genin since the days of the Night Aim," Naruto replied, and what's more, he could tell that the other boy was actually telling the truth, or had gotten way better at lying over the past 2.5 years. "I went on a mission with him once last year. He's a really good cook, and he tells the best stories," Naruto continued, looking slightly nostalgic. Most of the others in the group stared at Naruto in disbelief, as if they thought the more experienced genin was having them on. He almost thought that as well. It was just the sort of thing that an older genin would pull on the rookies. "Hey, you still got those cards you showed my team back in Kiri?" Naruto asked Kabuto. "Yes," the boy named Kabuto said, deflating slightly. It looked like Kabuto had wanted to show off for the newbies, and Naruto had just ruined the surprise. "Got one on Mariboshi Kosuka?" Naruto asked, grinning evilly. "Yes," the Kabuto boy said reluctantly as he pulled out a deck of orange cards with the kanji for shinobi written on the backs in black, and grabbed one from somewhere near the bottom. Kabuto then flipped the card over to reveal a blank white face, which changed to show information after he'd spun it around under his middle finger for a while. On the card, the picture of a man who looked to be around the same age as the Sandaime, maybe even older, was revealed. There was a listing of the number of missions the man had taken, which included over 2,500 D ranks alone. Next to that was a grid that showed his skill set, which was amazingly powerful, if he was reading the chart right. There were 3 other, much smaller pictures on the card, one of a boy, one of a girl, and one of a man with an old-fashioned haircut who looked to be wearing one of the early Jounin uniforms. "Mariboshi Kosuka," the boy named Kabuto said. "Voluntarily remained a genin for over 5 decades, after making a stupid mistake during the Chunin exams, and getting his 2 teammates killed." Kabuto gave Naruto a significant glance after this statement, and got a cold glare from Naruto in return. There was apparently some history behind this, and he could tell that it wasn't good. It probably had something to do with the fact that Naruto had failed the exams during his first try a year and a half ago. There had been a large number of rumors about that floating around, and he hadn't been sure what to believe back then, or even now. After Kabuto had placed Mariboshi Kosuka's card back in the deck, Sasuke requested information on someone named Rock Lee, and someone named Gaara. Kabuto obligingly pulled the requisite cards from the deck, apparently still hoping to impress the rookie genin despite Naruto ruining the show, as Naruto muttered when he ran into Gaara. Apparently, Naruto already knew one of the people that Sasuke was asking about. Amazing, Kabuto said after he'd pulled up the requested information on Gaara after a short lecture on some boy who had been in the spring cycle class and graduated 6 months before them. A genin, and he's already been on a B rank mission. I got one of those on my record, Naruto said, not sounding too impressed. I caught some dumbass Chunin who was trying to steal from the Hokage. The old man didn't pay me because I'd been there to prank him, and because the damage caused exceeded the appropriate amount of remuneration for such a mission. Well, apparently Gaara's returned from all of his missions completely uninjured, which is more than you can say, Kabuto said snippily, apparently somewhat upset with Naruto for ruining his fun. After his little display, and a number of cutting remarks aimed at Naruto, Kabuto launched into a lecture on the exams themselves, and the countries that would be participating, making it obvious that he was completely shunning Naruto as he did so, which was pretty damn funny since Kabuto was an Omega type and Naruto had evolved into an Alpha. The lecture came to an end when Kabuto had somehow ended up in a fight with some ninja from a new village called Otogekure, and he got his ass handed to him after he had started talking about them. As the fight was coming to an end, the proctors finally made their dramatic entrance. Dramatic entrances had to be like a prerequisite for being a ninja or something. As he sat waiting, Naruto felt his leg twitching as the seconds ticked down toward the time when he would flip his test over and get started. As he listened to the proctor announce the rules for this test, it became obvious to him that it was information gathering like he had suspected. 2 points off for cheating? As Satoshi had told him when he'd visited the other boy this morning, the first part of the exam was easy for someone who had passed it before to get past. It was the second part that was hard, since there was no predicting how that could go. When they were in IWA, Satoshi, Suzume, and Kurosaki had to navigate a rather rocky arid region that wasn't quite desert during a heat wave. Their objective had been to find the other half of some object they had been given, which had been hidden within a set area before another team could get their hands on it, and make their way to a rendezvous point within 3 days. While the second part of the exams usually followed along the simple lines of survival and wilderness while grabbing the counterpart to what you were given before someone else got it, or outright grabbing it from someone else who it was given to at the start, the real danger of that portion of the exam wasn't the unfamiliar terrain. It was the other teams. While he had the home ground advantage here unless they were forced to enter one of the closed-off areas that had been inaccessible even to him throughout his childhood, his team would be perfectly fine on the unfamiliar terrain aspect. It would be the other teams he would constantly have to worry about until that portion of the exams came to an end. While the genin from Konoha wouldn't kill their own, those from other countries probably wouldn't hesitate to kill them, and if even one member of their team was unable to continue due to injury, all 3 of them would fail the second portion of the exams. Eventually, the time to turn the test papers over and get a start on the first phase of the exams finally came. After he turned his over, he looked over the questions to see if there were any he could answer before resorting to cheating, since he didn't have that bit fully planned out. And he thought setting off an explosive tag and copying off the person next to him while everyone was distracted would get him thrown out, no matter how innovative it was. Crap. The problems were beyond tough. While he could probably figure out the code, the rest was beyond him. This stuff was high chunin, about to become jounin crap. It looked like he was going to have to catch someone cheating and do what they did if it were a copyable method. He wouldn't be able to do this more than once or twice, however, and he'd have to shift methods every time, because if he caught them cheating, then it was certain that the supervising chunin would as well. As he worked out his plan, he heard a small noise coming from the person seated next to him. He turned, and noted to his surprise that it was Hinata. He was so used to the girl these days that he barely registered her presence unless she deliberately did something to gain his attention, which she almost never did. He knew that the girl had a crush on him since she constantly stalked him, hanging around at the edges of his peripheral vision, but thanks to Suzum, who had experience in that area, he knew better than to approach her about it. He wasn't too bothered by her presence since she was nice enough, and he thought she would be a good friend if she got over her shyness, but he still didn't approach her. With Anata, it was like Suzum said, it was like hand-taming a small bird. You don't try to force the issue, as that would cause the bird to fly away, you wait for the bird to come to you. If you'd like to copy off my test, the girl started shyly, almost as if she were afraid to speak as she offered her test to him. Thanks. He signed in reply, as he quickly looked over her test and copied down the answer to only one of the 2 problems that she'd filled out already. There, that was one problem out of the way. Kabuto growled as his gaze landed on Naruto while he was looking around the room pretending to be trying to cheat. The only bit of enjoyment he got out of these crappy exams was showing off for the newbies, and Naruto had to go and ruin it for him. If Naruto hadn't been there, he was certain that the newbies would have been properly amazed and intimidated by his display, especially with that little show he'd arranged with the team from Oto. In Konoha, he was merely a genin and not regarded as an example of a very good one at that, despite his status as a medic, and naturally had to take the exams in order to attain a promotion, since field promotions were very seldom handed out during peacetime. Despite the fact that he was ostensibly attempting to obtain a promotion, he deliberately threw the exams every time he took them in order to gain information he otherwise would not have attained, or otherwise would have been forced to risk his life to attain through other means, as espionage was his true goal. Thanks to the exams, he knew the layouts of each of the hidden villages of the 5 elemental nations, and a great deal of information on the capabilities of hundreds of genin and dozens of chunin. The exams themselves, however, were a pain in the ass, despite it being completely worth it in the end. In Otogekure, he was a Tokubetsu jounin, and had gotten the rank the old-fashioned way, through the betrayal of his village. His true level of knowledge in the medical field was second only to perhaps Orochimaru or Tsunade, and in Oto, he got to show it off. There, he had assisted Orochimaru on a number of experimental procedures, and performed a few experiments himself. As a scientist, his hands itched to study a number of the people in the room, especially the 2 Jinchuriki and Uchiha Sasuke, who had apparently finally awakened his Sharingan. Realizing that he'd been gazing at the blonde menace while he'd been lost in his musings on the exams, he turned his gaze away from Naruto, and flicked it around the room in a logical search pattern. There. He'd found the plant. Time to start cheating. On the day I finally get Naruto onto my exam table, I'm going to forget the anesthetic, he thought as he started copying off the chunin who had been planted in the crowd. Chapter 19, Chunin Exams, Into the Forest. Naruto knew that he had a loud mouth at times, a lot of the time in fact, especially in situations when he was nervous and his life didn't depend on his being quiet. Tetsuo-sensei had worked with him on it for 2 years, and had only been marginally successful in his efforts, as he no longer ran around the village screaming for attention at the top of his lungs. When he was on missions, or when he was in what Konohamaru had dubbed that mood, he was relatively quiet. Other times, however, his noisiness in manner and volume was a form of stress relief, as well as an attention-seeking behavior. The Academy got to experience this in the form of a highly disruptive prankster. His former team had got to experience it in the form of a rather rowdy and rambunctious boy who practically bounced off the walls. His current team usually got to experience his loud nature in the form of some rather vicious arguments that were usually between him and Sasuke. Everyone who took the Chunin exams that day got a little taste of it as well, when he decided to be confrontational, and refused to back down despite the proctor's best efforts to get him and everyone else in the room to do so. He'd been under far more stress than he was willing to admit that day, despite the fact that he'd been telling himself that the second part of the exams would be a snap due to home ground advantage, because he knew that they wouldn't be even with the home ground advantage. No matter how many times he told himself that everything would be fine, he failed to convince himself, especially after Kabuto had just had to go and remind him exactly why he'd been lying to himself, and ruin what little good mood he had upon arriving for the test, adding extra pressure to what was already a tense situation. When the 10th question came around, much to his shame and embarrassment, he had found himself seriously considering joining those who were opting out and running. His teammates didn't have nearly the experience he did, and there were a large number of people here with far more experience than him, and just as many with more experience than him and his less experienced teammates who were running from the question as well. Considering how inexperienced they were, his teammates wouldn't stand a chance on their own during the second phase. And there was a distinct possibility that he wouldn't be able to protect them the way he hadn't been able to protect his former teammates and his comrades the last time he took the test, even with an extra year and a half as a ninja under his belt. Instead of raising his hand as he'd seriously considered doing, however, he had found himself rising to meet the challenge that the proctor at the front of the room had presented. He'd always hated it when people had told him he'd fail at something without ever giving him a chance to prove himself, and that Ibiki jerk had been strongly hinting that that was the case. "Bring it on, old man," he yelled when he got the proctor's attention. "I won't back down, and even if I fail, I'll find a way to become a chunin, even if I have to wait 3 decades for a field promotion." Instead of smacking him down for his audacity, as he expected would happen, the man looked around the room for a minute and smiled before informing everyone who had remained at the time of his rather ill-thought-out outburst that they had passed to the first portion of the exams. Apparently, the 10th question had been a first-phase surprise. He should have known that the proctor was springing a first-phase surprise on them. That had happened the last time he'd taken the exams as well. During the exams in Curie, the proctor had told them that they would have the choice of taking the old academy graduation test or not, and that those who chose not to take the graduation test would be sent home. If he'd been told beforehand exactly what Curie's old graduation test had been, he probably would have been one of the ones racing out of the room as fast as his legs could carry him. The fact that his teammates had stayed had made him wonder for a while, until he realized that they had quite likely been as ignorant of the particulars of that test as he had. He was rather violently jarred from his musings on the nature of the last first-phase surprise that had been sprung on him during the winter exams in Curie when one Mitarashi Enko, proctor for the second phase of the exams, made a dramatic entrance that would have normally scored a 7. But got an 8 for the sheer shock that it had caused when she had gone sailing in through a closed window while the proctor for the first phase was giving a dramatic speech on exactly why they had passed this portion of the exams that had included the display of a number of rather gruesome-looking scars. Enko was the wild sort of person that looked like she'd be a lot of fun to hang out with. Too bad she was so old that it would look weird if they did. Tomorrow morning, they would be taking the second test, and he would pass this one with his team intact, or he would die trying. As Ibiki gathered all of the written tests, one in particular caught his eye. It had been the one belonging to the child who had challenged him, and inspired such a large number of teams to continue in the process. The boy had only answered 4 of the questions on the test, making him one shy of the number that would have gotten him disqualified. "Sneaky little bastard," Ibiki muttered, chuckling as he gathered the rest of the tests. He really should have thought this test through better. With the way it had been set up, a couple of brainiacs and a few crafty little bastards like the Uzumaki had slipped through. Near the fence to the Forest of Death, Konohamaru grinned as the boss pretended to run away from his 3-person rock which contained himself and 2 of his classmates, Udan and Moegi. He jumped at the chance to interview the candidates in the Chunin exams for the Academy newspaper so he'd be able to wish Naruto luck before the second phase of the exams. He would not have been allowed in the area otherwise since it was restricted to all but the proctors, the Chunin hopefuls, and the Academy newsletter. His and his friends' dramatic entry had caused a great deal of laughter, especially when they had ended up choking on the colored smoke they had used because they had put a little too much gunpowder in the mix. The proctor, an awesome-looking lady with dark purple hair and skimpy clothes, looked about ready to yell at them, until they had informed her that they belonged there, because they had been ordered to do an article for the Academy paper. After the introductions had been gotten out of the way, she had given them 10 minutes to do their business and get gone. When he saw Naruto when he had arrived with his friends, his boss looked to be in that mood, but a few minutes of fun had picked his mood up considerably by the time their interview had finished, and they were forced to leave. Naruto had even introduced them to someone named Kabuto who apparently knew a lot about how the exams went in other countries, and had a bunch of cool ninja info cards to show them, and to give them a foreign perspective on the exams, Naruto had introduced them to a team from Suna. The two boys were rather scary, but the girl named Temari was rather nice. Moegi thought she was cool, and Udon looked as if he had a crush on her. All too soon, however, it was time to leave, and when they did so, Naruto was smiling and didn't look as nervous as he had when they arrived. Mission accomplished. Sorry about ruining your fun yesterday, Naruto said to Kabuto as they moved back towards the main group after seeing Konohamaru and his friends off. It's okay, Kabuto replied. Thanks for letting me do the interview with the academy students. You're welcome, he replied as Kabuto moved towards his team. They seemed even more impressed than my team did when you showed us your cards on the way to Kiri. As he made his way back to his own team, he couldn't help but stop and stare at the other Chunin hopefuls that were clustered near the fence that surrounded Training Ground 44. He honestly didn't know why so many of the teams had coordinated their outfits like Kabuto's team had. As far as he was concerned, doing something like that was a waste of both time and money. He couldn't have gotten his team to coordinate outfits even if he wanted to anyway. While Sasuke had gotten some shirts with the Uchiha fan discreetly stitched into the collar for situations in which he could go into battle, the boy would not budge on color, and only wore either black or blue. Sakura wouldn't budge on the color red either, just like the way he hadn't budged on the color orange, but was willing to wear more subdued shades if the situation called for it. When they made Chunin, though, all that would quite likely go out the window, as almost all Chunin wore the basic shinobi uniform, and only really started varying their attire again when they made Tokubetsu Jounin or Jounin. There were always a few holdouts or exceptions though, and Sakura would probably be one of them. All too soon it was time to enter the forest, the release forms were signed, the scrolls were handed out, and the wait was over. After another brief wait at a gate, they were inside the one forest near Konoha that he had not yet explored, as a guy in a mask had kept him out of it the one time he tried when he was little, which mostly negated the home ground advantage he'd been counting on. During the first few minutes in the woods, he caught some moron sniffing around the team and sent the idiot packing with his tail between his legs. Things went well for the next few hours after that, right up until everything went to hell. A wind that was most likely the result of a jutsu split the group, and he ended up being forced to kill a goddamn snake that had to be the size of his apartment building in order to get back to his teammates who had been left like sitting ducks. When he reached his teammates, it was only to find some bitch holding Sasuke and Sakura under the worst killing intent he'd ever felt. Even though he was a little ways away from where his teammates stood paralyzed, he could barely move himself. Fortunately, Sasuke managed to make his escape with Sakura before the two could be killed. Had the Uchiha left Sakura behind, he would have murdered the boy, teammate or no teammate, Sharingan or no Sharingan. One of the first rules he learned was that you don't leave a teammate behind. As Sasuke and Sakura fled from the bitch who'd attacked them, he followed them, doing his best to keep ahead of another building-sized snake that was hot on his tail. He and Sasuke both turned and killed the snake after Sakura had been gotten to safety, only to have the bitch who had apparently been controlling the creature burst out of it in a demented parody of a stripper hopping out of a cake, like the one Tetsuo sensei got in trouble for when someone hired her for his birthday party as a joke. The bitch whose Hittite said she was from grass then shot up the tree the team was in, looking very much like the animal whose insides she had burst forth from in a way that was reminiscent of a horror movie he and his teammates had watched that had left him hiding under his bed for an entire night. They just barely managed to dodge this new attack, and when they did, Sasuke offered up their scroll in a somewhat cowardly but sensible move considering the difference in power between their team and the grass kunoichi. The woman had been rather easily handing them their asses, and once she quit playing around, there was a good chance that they would die. While he lamented the lost chance to continue and possibly pass the exams this time around so he didn't start looking like the six-time loser Kabuto who was only now taking them as a formality rather than out of any hope of promotion, it was better that they got out of there with their lives and limbs intact. They could always try again in January. The bitch hadn't wanted the scroll, however. That had been made apparent when she destroyed it before their eyes and threw Sasuke into a nearby tree, knocking him out. It seems that the Sharingan wasn't nearly as powerful as I was led to believe, the bitch said to Sasuke, who was just regaining consciousness after that rather painful whack to the head. Either that, or you are a particularly worthless specimen. Since you showed the smallest amount of promise earlier, however, I'll give you one more chance to redeem yourself later, and if you don't do so, you'll die along with the rest of your pathetic village when the time comes. Until then, Sasuke-kun, the bitch said before she vanished. Who the hell was that? Sasuke groaned. I have no effing idea, but thanks to your boneheaded maneuver, we now need 2 scrolls instead of 1. He replied. It figured something would go wrong. It was almost as if he were cursed or something. If they failed because of this, he was going to be taking it out of Sasuke's hide later. It had been Sasuke who that bitch who had destroyed their scroll had been after all. In the middle of the forest, Anko stood on a tree branch sore and shaking, as the seal on her neck burned. This was supposed to be a nice relaxing job, a break between more strenuous missions. Instead, she'd run into Orochimaru, who had been trolling the forest for recruits, or more likely, considering what usually happened to the people he got his hands on, even his own students, test subjects for his experiments. Based on what the man had told her before he wandered off, he already had an unfortunate candidate in mind. She pitied the poor child, and hoped that he or she could manage to escape Orochimaru's clutches before something irreversible happened, such as the seal she had been given. She couldn't stop the Chunin exams, however, because they were all that were keeping Orochimaru entertained at the moment, and therefore keeping him from going on a killing spree and taking out anyone and everyone he came across. The genin in the forest were a small sacrifice when held up against the entire population of Konoha. After 2 days of searching following the debacle with the bitch from Grass, Naruto found the perfect team to steal scrolls from. They had gotten both of their scrolls in the middle of the night, and instead of heading straight to the tower like they should have done, the idiots had settled down for a nap. Since they weren't from Konoha, he didn't feel the least bit of guilt over taking their scrolls. Fortunately for him and his team, Satoshi had taught him a thing or two about making off with things that didn't belong to him, and these guys weren't jounin', not by a long shot. The guy on watch had been half asleep, and neither of his teammates had woken up when he wandered through their camp taking the scrolls and setting a couple of traps to slow them down when they became aware that he'd done so and attempted pursuit. Idiots. After that, it was a straight shot to the tower, during which he took point in case of traps. There had been a great many blocking their way, but he had been able to navigate past them, going around the ones he couldn't disable. Shortly after dawn on the 3rd day of the 2nd phase of the Summer Chunin exam, Team 7 arrived at the tower. Chapter 20, Chunin Exams, Preliminaries. As he stood before the teams of genin who had passed the 2nd phase of the exams, the Hokage shoved down his feelings of concern. Orochimaru had managed to infiltrate the exams, and they were forced to go on as if nothing had happened in order to keep Orochimaru from going on a rampage, and keep people from panicking until he actually did so, as the destruction they caused in their panic could be equal to or greater than any destruction Orochimaru may cause. While he personally wanted to stop what was happening, he knew that it would have to continue as if nothing were amiss. He gained a small measure of amusement from watching the shocked expressions of the genin who stood below him as he explained the true meaning and history of the exams in which they had decided to participate. Long ago, this would simply have been taken in stride. Now, however, after so many years of peace, he was in front of a generation that had never experienced the horrors of war, and therefore were shocked by the mere idea of it. When had he gotten so old? Standing below the Hokage and beside her teammates, Sakura felt her heart hammering in her chest as a set of unexpected preliminaries were being announced. Out of the 13 potentially passing teams, 7 had made it here intact. 2 others had made it here not so intact, and had been disqualified. 1 scroll had been destroyed by the woman who had also swallowed her own scroll who had attacked her team on the first day. That meant that 4 scrolls and therefore 2 teams were still out there unaccounted for, and unable to pass because they missed the deadline. Because of the unusually high number of passing teams, a set of preliminary matches were going to be held immediately in order to further whittle down the number of candidates before the 3rd phase of the exams, which would be taking place in front of an audience of important dignitaries at some point in the near future. The proctor for this preliminary bout was asking if anyone wished to quit here and now, especially since there was an odd number of candidates. The answer as far as she was concerned was hell no. She hadn't gone this far and risked this much to back down now. While she stood firm knowing that she was close to her goal of becoming a medic and whatever may follow it, the older boy named Kabuto that she had met during the first phase quit at that point, making the group an even 20. That decision to quit had made it his failure record for the Chunin exam 7 for 7. Personally, she didn't understand why someone would go so far and drop out when they were so close to their goal. Why even bother to enter in the first place if you were going to do something like that? Soon, attention was diverted from Kabuto's recent failure and towards the electronic board that would announce who was fighting who that had been revealed. Moments later, the first names appeared. Sasuke was first off the bat, and he would be facing the Sound Genin who had attacked Kabuto before the first test. Orochimaru watched in anticipation as the Uchiha boy made his way down into the indoor arena where he would be fighting one of his minions. Despite the fact that the boy had given such a disappointing showing in the forest, he had decided to stay and watch the preliminaries. He was giving his potential vessel one more chance to prove his strength. If the boy failed here and therefore failed to reach the arena next month, he would be as worthless as the rest of Konoha and would deserve to die in the invasion. He would not run the chance of severely weakening himself by pouring himself into a fragile vessel. There was still a question of whether or not this one was truly as weak as he had appeared, however. He wasn't entirely certain if it had been cowardice or pragmatism that had led the Uchiha to hand over his scroll 5 days ago when he had gone against him in the forest. Today, he would be able to tell which it had been. While handing the scroll over was a cowardly act on the surface, it was also an act of pointless stupidity to throw one's life away fighting an opponent they couldn't defeat for little to no gain, especially when what you desired could come to you more easily if you were prepared to wait. If Uchiha Sasuke failed the preliminaries, he would prove his utter worthlessness and would die before he left the building. If he succeeded, he would watch the boy during the third phase of the exams and see how he compared to the strongest of his generation, especially the Jinchuriki. If Sasuke proved himself as strong as he thought him to be, he would take the boy then and there. If he didn't prove his strength to be superior, however, the last Uchiha would die, and good riddance. He'd never cared for the Uchiha anyways. They were overly proud and arrogant, content to rest on the laurels of bygone ancestors, and a rather treasonous lot to boot. The only thing he found even potentially useful about them were their eyes, which he had a cloned stockpile of that he hadn't bothered using because he'd have to cover an implanted eye when not in use to prevent it from draining his chakra the way the Kakashi boy did. There were several other Kekkai Genkai he could take if the Uchiha proved to be an utter failure, but the Uchiha's eyes were the one that would put him much closer to his goal of learning every jutsu ever created. The eyes would be useless to him, however, if they were housed in a weak body, as that would weaken him as well. With the chakra drain involved when using Sharingan eyes that weren't one's own, he would much prefer taking the Uchiha boy as a vessel than taking his eyes from his corpse or using the ones he'd stockpiled when making Shimura Danzo's special arm, but he would implant them if left with no other alternatives. Instead of drawing one of the strongest available amongst the group of candidates that were in the preliminaries, someone who would bring out the Uchiha boy's true strength so he wouldn't have to wait another month to see it. Sasuke's opponent had turned out to be one of his throwaway pawns that he had planned to use to test Sasuke's ability to handle the seal he had planned on placing on the boy, until the Uchiha child had proven to be somewhat of a disappointment. Rather than being a foil to test the newly acquired curse seal against, the minion would now be a secondary test of the power of the Uchiha child as well as his prized Sharingan. As he'd more than half expected he would, Sasuke had proven himself far more able with a foe he believed he had a chance of defeating, proving that his handing over his scrolls several days before had been more an act of pragmatism than cowardice. There had been more than 4 days left before the deadline, and a number of scrolls floating around where the boy could get his hands on them after all. Why keep something that could cost you your life when you could get something just like it elsewhere, and from someone much weaker than the opponent you were facing after all? After a rather short fight in which Sasuke proved himself to be superior to his opponent in every way, Sasuke eventually finished Dosa off with a move that his father had been rather famous for during the days when he'd served on the field rather than as the chief or police. As he watched the trap Dosa burn, he found himself eagerly anticipating Sasuke's next test, the one that would prove whether or not the boy truly was worthy of his time and attention. All too soon for the participants in that match, the second set of names were called. Abumizaka made his way down to the arena floor a second after Aburame Shino. When the time for the battle came, he wasted no time in blasting the boy in the trenchcoat with his Zankaha. The boy evaded his attacks with relative ease, however, and called upon an army of bugs. Growing frustrated with his lack of success, he then tried to blast both the boy and the bugs only to have his arms ripped apart from the inside. He lay on the ground in unbearable agony, knowing that he'd failed both Lord Orochimaru and himself. His technique had backfired on him, ripping his arms open to relieve the pressure because his opponent had crammed the openings in his palms full of bugs. Once again he had been overconfident and tried to fly too high, and once again he had failed. He had failed himself, and Lord Orochimaru, who had taken him off the streets and had made him strong so he would never again have to stoop so low as to risk his life in order to steal a crust of bread in order to survive. After his name was called, Inuzuka Kiba felt somewhat uncertain as he made his way to the arena floor. While he had always been able to defeat Naruto rather easily back at the academy, that had been over 2.5 years ago, and Naruto had changed a great deal since then. The loud-mouthed prankster who couldn't be serious if he tried that he knew and skipped classes with long ago looked very serious at the moment. Instead of bouncing with excitement, or trembling with fear like he would have been doing when they were in the academy together, he was almost completely still as they stood in front of the proctor and waited for their fight to start. He opened the fight with one of his better moves, a move that would have knocked the old Naruto out for days, in order to test the boy. Instead of standing there and taking the blow as he would have done back then, Naruto managed to dodge. At the very least, the Uzumaki's speed had improved to some degree since the academy. Deciding to try a different tack, he threw a couple of smoke bombs at Naruto in order to cover his attacks. Then, he and Akamaru launched themselves into the fight. Despite the disorienting smoke, they soon found themselves launched out of it again, heading in different directions with an explosive tag attached to each of them. Fortunately, the boy had placed a tag with a slightly longer timer on Akamaru, allowing him to save the dog from serious injuries, which had apparently been his plan all along, since Naruto went on the offensive while he was distracted with rescuing Akamaru. Before he knew it, he was on the ground and in pain, and Akamaru was on the ground on the other side of the arena. In a rather desperate move, he pulled out a pair of food pills. If he wanted any chance of passing, there was nothing left to do but pull out his best attack. And to think, he was going to have to use the Gutsuga against the boy who had been touted as the absolute last of the class for a few years before he somehow managed to graduate the academy 2 years early, the boy he used to be able to easily pound into the dirt whenever he wanted to. After taking one of the pills, he tossed the other to Akamaru, but Naruto caught it before it could reach the dog, and crushed it underfoot. Throwing another to replace the one that had been destroyed would be pointless, since Naruto would just catch and destroy that one as well. With the way things were going, he would have to hope Akamaru was able to distract Naruto while he did the Tsuga instead. Preparing for his solo attack, he threw another 2 smoke bombs to disorient his opponent, and Akamaru launched himself into the smoke cloud. After Akamaru jumped in to pin his opponent, he flew towards the boy, spinning at an insane rate, while Akamaru attacked from the other side. The attack failed, however, because Naruto had managed to shake Akamaru off and dodge his attack and counter it, even with the smoke cloud disorienting him. Still desperate to win or at the very least land a single blow, he flew at Naruto once more, and the result was the same. Eventually, after giving his best, and after several failed attacks, he was forced to admit defeat when Naruto finally knocked him down one more time, then he could rise. Naruto definitely wasn't the Omega of the pack he remembered, but an alpha in his own right. After Kiba had forfeited, Sakura's heart leapt into her throat as the next 2 names came up on the board. She would be fighting Ino next. Ino, who had once been her friend, Ino, who was her rival for Sasuke's affections, Ino, whom she had been trailing after practically all her life, Ino, who was a beautiful cosmos flower while she was still a bud, was her opponent, and she would have to fight her if she wanted to pass the exam so she could be free to become a medic. Back when they were in the academy together, Ino had defeated her in just about everything but academics. Ino had trounced her during their taijutsu spars, and outperformed her in the womanly arts. Ino had beat her then, and would quite likely beat her now. Even though she was afraid to face her, she would have to, since the other girl was standing in the way of her future. She would have to defeat Ino, who had always been better than her, in order to move forward. Swallowing down her nervousness, she made her way to the arena floor. She would have to get past her fear and give it her all and pray that it was enough. As Ino was being led away from the arena, the girl found herself wondering if she knew Sakura anymore, as her former friend had changed a great deal in the months since she had last seen her. Someone had apparently replaced the somewhat insecure girl she had known with a competent kunoichi while she hadn't been looking. The girl whom she had expected to fall to her might had instead risen to the challenge, and taken the advantage presented to her when she had rather stupidly pulled one of her punches, believing Sakura to still be as weak as she used to be. Thanks to that pulled punch, she had been steadily driven into a corner by the girl's furious onslaught which had followed, until she had eventually fallen. After years of winning in just about every arena other than love, she had finally lost to Sakura. Kakashi proudly greeted Sakura after she'd returned from her fight with the Yamanaka girl. Despite their differences, his team had performed admirably so far. They had managed to work together long enough to make their way through the forest to the tower, and all three of them had passed the preliminary matches, advancing to the next round. He was slightly worried about Sasuke though. The boy obviously had some anger issues. Using a jutsu like the Ryoka no Jutsu in a preliminary bout had been overkill, especially since he already had his opponent on the ropes and pretty much defeated when he used it, making its use highly unnecessary. Naruto had of course performed admirably as always, just as his father would have done. The boy had used excellent strategies to take out the Inuzuka's greatest advantages and carry the day. He would not have expected any less of Minato-sensei's son. In her recent battle, Sakura had somehow managed to surprise him as well. The girl had grown greatly over the last couple of months. The student he had thought the weakest and least likely to succeed had managed to defeat the daughter of the head of the Yamanaka family. Not only had she managed to defeat the girl, she had defeated her soundly. He probably wasn't going to forget that rather vicious bit of hair pulling she had engaged in order to win any time soon though. Fortunately for Sakura, Naruto had convinced her to pin her hair up and cover it for the exams. Only 4 bouts into the preliminaries, and he could already brag that his entire team had passed into the finals. Not bad. It would be even better if Guy's team didn't pass though. He'd be able to hold it over the man's head for years if that happened. Chapter 21, Chunin Exams, Preliminaries 2. As soon as Sakura and Ino cleared out of the arena, the names for the 5th fight in the preliminaries were called and Kankuro and Akado Yoroi made their way down to the arena. Kankuro had rather cleverly in his opinion switched himself out with Karasu when everyone had been paying attention to the bitch fight between the 2-leaf kunoichi that had been passed off as a preliminary bout, and therefore was being carried into the arena rather than walking. Soon, Yoroi and Karasu were standing in front of the proctor who was refereeing the preliminaries waiting for their fight to start. The moment the signal was given, both Karasu and Yoroi burst into motion. Yoroi grabbed the only bit on Karasu that would have been exposed skin on Kankuro, his face. Despite his facial covering that masked all expression, the man somehow managed to look completely stunned when absolutely nothing happened after he'd grabbed Kankuro's face. Whatever the man had planned to do had apparently required physical contact with the real Kankuro in order for him to pull it off. Following Yoroi's failure, Karasu went on the offensive, and beat Yoroi to a pulp at Kankuro's direction. Kankuro found the fight to be easy, and was amused by the fact that he never once been forced to show himself throughout the entire bout. Apparently his opponent had been a one-trick pony, and he'd somehow neutralized that trick without even trying. As soon as the proctor announced his victory, he swapped places with Karasu, and made his way back to Baki-sensei and his siblings. There was no reason to remain wrapped in those stifling bandages any longer than necessary. Practically the instant Kankuro returned to his teammates, the names for the 6th bout were announced. Temari would be fighting someone named Tenten. As she made her way down to the arena and proctor who would start the match, Temari sized her opponent up. The girl looked more serious than her other Konoha counterparts, and obviously hadn't spent as much time on her hair and clothing as that ridiculous pair who had been clawing at each other and trying to pull the other's hair had done. Good, this might actually be a real match, rather than a bitch fight like the one that had taken place between the two other leaf kunoichi. In the opening moves of their fight, her opponent showed herself to be something of a budding weapons specialist when she went on the offensive. It was such a pity that she had to come up against a wind mistress considering. Unlike just about every other girl in Konoha that she'd encountered during her stay, the girl actually seemed to take her position as a kunoichi seriously. She would rather have seen her in the final phase of the exams than that pink-haired harridan who spent a good minute pulling that blonde's hair. When the girl realized that her initial moves had failed and that she would need to step up her game, she released 3 storage scrolls worth of weapons, and did something with ninja wire that undoubtedly would have caught Kankuro's interest as a puppet master before the bout was over. But eventually the fight ended in her favor as she blew the last of the weapons away and caught the girl in a kamaitachi no jutsu, which was rather aptly named after the sickle weasel which floated through the winds, slicing anyone it encountered with its razor-sharp claws according to legend. After catching the wounded girl on her fan, she flicked her aside and one of the boys on her team jumped down and caught her before she hit the ground. After the boy had caught his teammate, she talked a bit of trash with the boy she could be battling in a month, and left the arena. While she had a little more respect for her opponent than she did the 2 other kunoichi she had seen battle, she still found the leaf kunoichi to be weak compared to her. She had hoped for a greater challenge than the one she had gotten, only to have those hopes dashed. Considering the apparent strength of the leaf's forces, when it came time for the invasion, Konoha was going to be toast. As soon as Tenten's weapons were all cleared from the arena floor, the names for the 7th bout were selected and announced. Lee wasn't sure if he should be happy or disappointed that he had been selected to fight Akimichi Tsuji. While the Akimichi were powerhouses when it came to taijutsu, the heavy boy was both slower and less experienced than him, thus the disappointment. The potential joy over the selection of his opponent came from the fact that he would have a much better chance of advancing to the finals and facing a truly strong opponent during the 3rd phase of the exams in front of all of the dignitaries that the Hokage had mentioned, proving that a genius of hard work could succeed. The battle that came next was short, and almost brutally one-sided, as even with the weights holding him back he moved far too quickly for Tsuji to counter. Tsuji's punches and kicks were undoubtedly powerful, as was his human bullet tank technique, but he had been able to rather easily avoid them, and kicking Tsuji around like he were a soccer ball had not been nearly as fun as it had apparently looked to his audience, who had cheered when Tsuji had hit the far wall of the arena. He had been hoping for a most youthful battle in which both parties gave their all, but it looked like he would have to wait until the 3rd phase for that to happen. As soon as Lee and the rather battered Tsuji were cleared from the arena floor, the names for the 8th bout were announced. They were Hyuga Hinata and Hyuga Niji. Hinata, who had been over the moon about the fact that Naruto was actually speaking with her, even if it was only about the properties of the homemade medicinal ointment that she had given him, had been forcefully slammed down to earth by the name of her opponent. That couldn't possibly have been a random selection. Someone had to have bribed whoever it was that programmed the board, either that, or a Hyuga had programmed the board at some point when it became apparent that preliminaries would be necessary. She understood why it had been done. Compared to Niji and her younger sister, she was weak. If she somehow made it to the final part of the exams and failed in front of the assembled dignitaries, her family would be seen as weak. By having her fight Niji and be eliminated now, it was guaranteed that a Hyuga would make it to the final phase, and not shame the family when they did so. She felt sadness and anger at this. She had worked so hard to be strong, and had hoped to prove to herself and everyone around her that she was so during the Chunin exams. She had always wanted to be like Naruto, who always picked himself back up off the ground and climbed ever higher after every time he did so. Every time she faced an obstacle, however, she found herself stopping and backing away. This time didn't appear to be an exception, as while Niji kept telling her that she was a failure, and always would be a failure, she found herself drawing in on herself, trying to protect herself from his words. Suddenly, as she was about to give up, a voice that never failed to cause her heart to skip a beat called out, "Come on, Hinata, don't give up now. I know for a fact that you're much better than this." Naruto believed in her. Naruto believed in her. She couldn't give up now. She had to prove to both herself and everyone else that she was as strong as Naruto believed her to be. Emboldened by the words of the boy she admired, she moved to strike. Niji provided no openings, no matter what she did, however. Eventually, after what seemed like forever, her eyes found one. She scored a hit. She scored a hit against Niji. She could do this. She couldn't do this. Niji proved too strong and too fast. He closed all of the tenketsu on her arms, disabling her juken strikes. All she could do now was try to block him. She couldn't block him forever, and the pain in her chest from one of his earlier strikes grew to be too much. She collapsed, and nearly lost consciousness. As the proctor announced her defeat, and the jounin moved in to save her from Niji's next attack, she struggled to rise. She wouldn't stay down. She wouldn't stay down. She would get up like Naruto. She stood, and then she fell. Naruto clutched the railing in shock. If he had known that this would happen, he would not have called out any encouragement despite the fact that he'd promised Hinata that he'd be rooting for her as she'd left for the arena floor. He had seen Hinata faltering, and decided then would be a good time to cheer her up a bit, especially since he now considered her to be something of a friend now that he'd actually talked to her. After he'd loudly cheered her on, Hinata had fought instead of forfeiting like she had looked like she had been about to do. She had fought bravely, and now, because she had fought, she could die. Niji, however, had not needed to be so brutal. He had not needed to put Hinata down so much, and he had not needed to attack her so viciously, especially considering the fact that Hinata was both family and a comrade to the Hyuga boy. Hinata was his friend, and as soon as he got a chance to do so, he was going to show Niji exactly what he did to people who harmed his friends. If Hinata's teammates didn't take him out back and show him what they did to people who hurt their teammate first, that is. As her teammates, the Inuzuka and the Aburame had first dibs on any actions that might be taken against the Hyuga bastard for what he'd done to Hinata. As she was carried off, Niji watched his cousin, who persisted in calling him Big Brother despite the fact that he had done everything to make it clear that he disliked her, go. She had proven herself a loser as fate had decreed her to be, but as he looked back on the fight, he remembered the moment that her eyes had changed, and how there had been steel in her spine if only for a little while. In that moment, she had seemed strong and fierce, and traces of that fierceness had remained in the moments afterward when she refused to quit even though it was obvious from the beginning that she had lost, and in the moment she rose despite the fact that she should have stayed down. She had lost as fate decreed she would, however. People don't change. Once a loser, always a loser. There were no exceptions. As soon as Niji walked away confident in his understanding of how the world worked, the 9th match was called, and it was Naruto Shikamaru and Tsuchi-kin who would be fighting in this bout. Shikamaru wouldn't have bothered, except that it would be more troublesome for him if he backed out now, since he had failed to back out when he'd been given the chance to do so. If he just stayed up here now, he'd be hearing about it from his peers, his teammates, his mother, and Asuma sensei for years. Whether he won or lost, it would be better to just get it over and done with now so he wouldn't have to hear anything about it from anyone. Kin proved to be an interesting if somewhat easy-to-read opponent. After determining the nature of her sound-based genjutsu attack, he swiftly caught her in his cage main, and made her knock herself out by hitting her head against a nearby wall, while dodging a flying shuriken. Now that that was over and done with, he couldn't wait for the 10th battle to take place so he could get the hell out of here and maybe catch some cloud watching time before the team went out for Chuji's consolation dinner. After the unconscious Kin had been cleared away, the 10th match was called, and it was Gaara against Tsurugi Misumi. As Misumi made his way down to the arena, he wondered exactly how hard a time he would have of it. Kabuto had informed him of Gaara's status as the Jinchuriki of the one-tailed Tanuki Shikaku. This meant that in regards to power, his opponent was stronger than the average jounin, and he would have to end this quickly. Trying to get the fight over with as fast as possible, he moved to the boy the instant the start of the fight was called, and dislocated his limbs so the boy couldn't just throw him off when he wrapped himself around him as he did so. When he grabbed the boy in order to squeeze him to death or unconsciousness at the very least, it had probably looked like a weird sort of hug to everyone who had been watching, since he'd gone for the front as the boy's back was covered by a giant gourd. As he tried to crush the boy, he could feel sand move under his arms. Suddenly he felt himself flying away from the boy, his limbs ripping off and going in different directions as sand flew into his face, blinding him. There was more pain than he'd ever felt in his entire life, and everything went black. After the 10th bout had ended, and those who passed had lined up before him, Gecko Hate looked over the group of genin who had made it to the 3rd phase of the exams. They were a strong bunch, and would most likely go far. Soon, the Hokage finished his speech to the young shinobi that were arrayed before him, and he went along the line with the box that contained the numbered slips of paper that would determine in which order the genin would fight. Once he reached the end and the last number had been taken, the candidates called out their numbers. 1. Hyuga Niji called. 5. Aburaim Shino called. 3. Rock Lee called. 4. The Suna Genin Kankuro called. 2. Uzumaki Naruto called. 7. The Suna Genin Temari called. 6. Nara Shikamaru called. 9. Uchiha Sasuke called. 10. The Suna Genin Gaara called. 8. Haruno Sakura called. The matches for the 3rd phase of the Summer Chunin exams will be Hyuga Niji vs Uzumaki Naruto, Rock Lee vs Kankuro, Aburaim Shino vs Nara Shikamaru, Temari vs Haruno Sakura, and Uchiha Sasuke vs Gaara. He announced after the last genin had called out her number. After the matches had been called, the preliminaries had ended and everyone including Kakashi had gone home. As he made his way into his apartment, and tossed his vest onto a chair that was completely covered in dog hair, Kakashi sighed in relief that ordeal was over. A moment later, he whirled and pulled out a kunai as he made his way to his minuscule kitchen to attack the person who was sitting at his dining table without his leave. He then lowered the kunai when he saw exactly who it was that was sitting at his table, leafing through one of his few non-Ika books and chowing down on the leftovers he'd planned on having for dinner. "Hello, Jiraiya," he said. "Long time no see." That's it for part 5. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.